Hi there, my name is Matt Bailey and welcome to my Skyrim Level Design showcase video. In this video I'm simply going to play through my level, Anthzmar Caverns, and interject here and there to explain some of my design decisions. So, the dungeon is located near to the small town of Riverwood, so it is discoverable very early on. However, once we get inside you'll realise that this dungeon is not for low level players. It's aimed towards Skyrim players who desire a combat related challenge, and so my design focus when building it was difficult enemy encounters. Because of this, I recommend only taking on the dungeon if your character is level 30 or above. As you can see, I have a rather high level character here with full Daedric armour, and this dungeon is still going to prove challenging for me. Okay, so here's the dungeon entrance. As you can see, we have a fallen adventurer here with a note that reads, "My friends have perished. There were too many. The Falmer are too savage, the Dummer machinations too powerful. I am afraid none shall be able to reclaim the lost weapons that lie in the deep dark of Anthzmar Caverns. Angered." The skeleton lying here with Falmer arrows scattered around serves as some environmental storytelling. The player can tell that he was slain by strong Falmer enemies. The note alludes to the difficulty of the dungeon, but it also provides an incentive to the player for reaching the bottom, the lost weapons. That is what we have to go inside and retrieve. The first room here has just a couple of easy and medium difficulty Falmer enemies. This is to ease the player into the action slowly instead of throwing them straight in at the deep end. As you will see throughout my playthrough, I am predominantly using my own favourite playstyle: archery for distance and encounters, and a two-handed greatsword for close quarters combat. The level is designed to allow for a large variety of playstyles that Skyrim makes possible by using space in different ways. This room favours close quarters combat as it is relatively small. However, there are areas later on with longer lines of sight, choke points and tighter corridors to allow for the varying types of combat encounters. In level design, lighting is one of the most effective methods of guiding the player. As you can see here, the room's exit is lit up by some bright blue glowing mushrooms. This should catch the player's eye and inform them of where to go next. This next room features a high ledge that makes for the perfect archery position. It allows the player to sneakily pluck away at the enemies below without being detected. It also acts as a one-way valve. Once the player jumps down, they cannot get back the way they came. This serves to instill a sense of unease and of being trapped. The only way is forwards. Off to the right here is our first optional loot room. I have included many of these throughout the level to reward the player for exploring, and to allow them to gather items that may aid them against the enemy encounters, such as potions. Having optional areas in a level increases player agency, the player's sense of choice and decision making. Within this next room lies one of the most challenging enemy encounters, a horde of Falmer and Chorus enemies. This acts as one of the few peaks of high action in the level, as there are a large number of enemies and the player will be in combat for a relatively large amount of time. As you can see, the exit to the room is well lit with two huge glowing mushrooms and features grand Dwemer architecture to draw the player's eye. This encounter lends itself to players with a high sneak skill, as it allows the player to pick off enemies one by one instead of facing the group together. However, as you will see, a high level tank player who prefers melee combat can take this group head on, as I have utilised environmental assets like boulders and pillars to create cover and choke points that the player can use to effectively kite enemies and pick them off. The room has optional chests with high tier loot. This increases the player's chances to find equipment and potions that may help them get through this difficult encounter. There are two boss level Falmer near the entrance to the Dwemer ruins. They act as one last challenge to give the player a higher sense of accomplishment when they defeat the Horde and gain access to the next part of the dungeon. Next are two Dwemer loot rooms. These are guarded by just a couple of enemies of the easiest difficulty. This area provides the player with some rest after the previous high action encounter. Maintaining peaks and troughs of action is essential to level pacing. It makes the high action encounters hit harder for the player. If the level maintained one long high peak of action from start to finish, it just wouldn't have the same impact. These loot rooms feature many health potions that the player will surely need in the battles to come, as well as some essentials like weapons, armour and ammunition. As can be seen here, I use a light position behind some rubble to intrigue the player. If they choose to trust their instincts, they will be rewarded with this high tier loot chest and a strong fire resistance potion that may help the player with one of the traps later in the level. The next room is the Forge Room. This contains multiple valuable enchanted armors and weapons. The player may choose to loot these to replace subpar gear or to sell later on. I intended to make this room resemble a dwarven forge room where they might assemble dwarven centurions. This is to help the player expect more encounters with these huge monsters later on in the level. There are a couple of crafty dwarven centurion ambushes set up in this area. Firstly is a less obvious centurion ambush. Upon opening this rather unassuming chest, the player will wake a centurion hidden in the shadows. The intent here is to surprise the player with a difficult enemy encounter when they think they are safe. This opens up their mind to the possibility of being ambushed, and the thought should sit at the back of their minds for the rest of the level to increase the sense of tension. The player should also notice this well-lit, nice and shiny loot chest on the other side of this door. However, it's locked and cannot be picked. The player's first instinct, as we are playing Skyrim, is to look for a lever, button or key to get it to open. There just so happens to be a lever next to this dormant dwarven centurion. Upon activating the lever to open the door, the centurion will activate too and attack the player. It is fairly apparent that pulling the lever will activate the centurion due to its positioning, so the player will have to weigh up the risk versus the reward. This again serves to increase player agency. The next section of the level features long tight corridors that lend themselves to archery and magic due to long lines of sight, and close quarters combat due to the pipes and rubble lining the walls. Here the player will be ambushed by spiders and spheres. The dim lighting here and the packed in pipes and rubble should further increase the player's sense of tension and make enemy encounters more difficult and feel more frantic. I used light again here to guide the player to a hidden chest. This pipe provides an elevated platform that the player can use to gain the high ground on the enemies below and fire arrows or spells from far away. Here, the player comes to another locked door that cannot be picked. The player will naturally look around to find something that might open it, and their eyes will be drawn to this lever by a bright light. It is clear that the player cannot access it from here, so they must take the path through the corridors to get there. This section features multiple vertical pipes that the player may choose to use as choke points to help them pick off enemies one at a time. This supports any close quarters playstyle, whether it's magical or melee. There are a couple of optional loot rooms for the player here, one of which features a locked cage with many powerful potions. These are protected by a high level lock to give the player a greater sense of satisfaction upon claiming the treasure, having worked harder to get it. These rooms also serve as some looting downtime from the high action Forge Room Centurions and corridor encounters. Here, the player can see the lever at the end of the corridor. Upon pulling it, 2 spider ambushes are triggered to surprise the player and to make them work just that bit harder before they progress. The player can simply drop down here to avoid any backtracking, which many players find tedious. This room is large and grand with a long line of sight. The grander architecture here should signify to the player that they are nearing the end of the level. The long line of sight straight through the middle of the room makes it ideal for archery and ranged magic. I tucked multiple dwarven spiders out of sight behind these barriers and pipes at the edge of the room to take the player by surprise with a sudden swarm. These enemies explode upon being defeated and they are of quite high difficulty. This should provide a peak of visceral action for the player and serves as a challenging encounter. There is also a small fire trap that the player can utilise to their advantage. By shooting this lamp they can set the oil on the floor ablaze and deal damage against any enemies in that area. The next section serves as some more downtime for the player between the last room and the final encounter. There are few enemies and a couple of traps. The first trap is a fire pillar trap linked to a chest. The player can see a burnt body on the floor next to the chest, which should arouse suspicion and act as effective environmental storytelling. The player can assume that this is one of Anthzmar's fellow adventurers that perished, as mentioned in his note at the dungeon entrance. The Centurion bust looking down on the player also instills a feeling of foreboding. These fire pillars will remain on so they deal a large amount of damage to the player unless they get away from the chest quickly. The fire resistance potion that the player may have found earlier may aid them greatly here. The second trap is here at the entrance to the final room. There is a locked door and a lever, as the player should be used to seeing by now. It is clear that the only thing that will open the door is the lever, however there are 3 dwarven ballistas pointing at the lever. These will activate upon the lever being pulled. The most effective strategy here would be to pull the lever and use the whirlwind sprint shout to avoid the explosion. This is something that my target audience of skilled and experienced Skyrim players should pick up on easily. This lever also activates a series of Dwemer Thresher traps in the next room that the player must navigate to reach the centre. The final room is huge and grand to signify to the player that this is the climax of the level. There is a large raised platform in the centre of the room with a large archway and 2 braziers either side to draw the player's eye. This makes it clear to the player that this is where they should go next. On this platform is a table featuring the lost weapons mentioned in Anthzmar's note. Upon nearing the platform, the door to the room will close, trapping the player, and the threshers will deactivate, so that the player cannot use them to beat the final encounter. 4 dwarven centurions of the highest level will begin to waken. This is the final boss encounter. The lost weapons are custom-made variants of dwarven weapons, each with improved stats and enchantments that should help the player defeat this brutal encounter. There should be a weapon to support each playstyle, as there is a powerful bow, 1-handed sword, 2-handed battle axe, and a spell. The door at the end of the room to the exit is locked, and can only be opened with a key. The player must defeat the final encounter to gain access to the key. As can be seen here, the multitude of potions found earlier in the level are a great help for the final encounter, rewarding the player for picking them up and exploring. After defeating the encounter, the player will find a key to the exit lift on one of the Centurion's bodies. They are also free to explore the room. There is plenty of loot scattered around, including chests. One of these chests is hidden underwater to reward any players that wish to fully explore under the water's surface. The high grade loot here should give the player a higher sense of satisfaction as they are being rewarded for their efforts. The player may then take the key and exit the dungeon to their freedom. That concludes my Skyrim level design, Anthzmar Caverns.